Let me first start off with Ptolemy. I don't know if we know that he really looked like this, but Ptolemy, was one of the greatest scientists ever and most influential scientists. And his most important work is, of course, Al-Majest, which is Arabic for the greatest. And in it, he sort of codifies the geocentric universe. And this Earth-centered universe prevailed for centuries until Copernicus and Galileo turned that around. But what I want to call your attention to are notes that he penned in the margin of the manuscript of his work. Let me remind you that back then, you would look up at the night sky and the planets would move against the background stars. They would wander, because that's what the word means in Greek, is wanderer. And there were 7 of these objects, the sun and moon included. And they would just kind of move. They'd go to the left, and then they'd slow down and pause, and then they'd back up, and then they'd reverse again. And this was a mystery, complete mystery. And of course, the heavens were not Earth, and so the fact that you didn't really understand what was going up there was kind of okay and expected, because that was the work of the gods. And we, being mortal down here on Earth, if you can't understand it, don't lose sleep over that fact. You perhaps never will. Now, Ptolemy had sort of the best going explanation anyone had put forth with the epicycles and the like. But nonetheless, this is the boundary between what is known and unknown about how the machinery of the universe works, and he pens these words, which for me are one of the most beautiful and poetic references to the state of one's knowledge ever written. I know that I am mortal by nature and ephemeral, but when I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies, I no longer touch earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia. And so therein is this emotional, he's got this sort of religious feeling at the limits of his knowledge. And this is a trend that will continue for thousands of years to follow this. At least 2,000 years to follow this. Some of the greatest minds that have preceded us have done just this. Okay? That's Ptolemy. But we can go on. Who else do we have? Oh, Galileo, interesting case. And so he was kind of I see him as one of the first to say, all right, if religion has if there's any point and purpose to it, it's not to serve as a science textbook. Okay, so he was kind of the first to suggest this division, not to get rid of religion. Of course, like I said, he was a religious fellow himself. Sir Isaac Newton. Now, I don't know what you know of Isaac Newton, but everything I've read of his tells me that there's no greater genius to ever walk the surface of this earth. By the way, in his Principia, here's the page 1, page 0 of Principia. In it, he discovers the laws of motion, F equals ma, discover the laws of gravity. It's all there. And he did this all before he turned 26. And in this, when he talks about motion, there's no reference to God. When he talks about his two-body force that he deduced, this universal law of gravitation, there is no mention of God. It's just not anywhere there, because he understood it. He was on top of it. He was there. Even though the understanding of the motions of the planets before he came along was given unto God, because nobody understood it, or nobody understood well enough to really believe that they had a full predictive handle on it in the way the universal law of gravitation supplied. And so what you have is Isaac Newton abandoning reference to God until he realizes that if all you do is calculate the two-body problem, here we have like the moon and earth. Yes, he's got that calculated. Now you have the sun and the earth. You got that. But wait a minute, now the earth and the moon go around the sun, and sometimes we're close to Mars and sometimes we're not. And when it comes near Mars, there's a tug that's stronger there than in any other part in the orbit. And then it comes over here, and then Jupiter tugs. And it's all these mini tugs. And so he's got to do this two-body problem for Earth, the moon, Earth and the sun, Earth, moon, and Mars, Earth, moon, Mars, and Jupiter, and it becomes a rapidly complex problem. And he realizes that, in fact, applying this simple sort of approach to calculating the stability of the solar system, he finds he can't stabilize the solar system. He can't account for how we have stayed this way for as long as what was possibly necessary from the beginning of the universe. And so what does he say? He's at his limits. He's at his limits. And so you read Principia, God is nowhere until you get to the general Sholem. And then he says, the 6 primary planets are revolved about the sun in circles concentric with the sun, and with motions directed towards the same parts and almost in the same plane. He's got the whole picture now, and he's trying to sort of account for that. But he can't just simply doing 2-body calculations, certainly not without a computer or without a new kind of mathematics. He says, but is it not to be conceived that mere mechanical causes could give birth to so many regular motions? This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This is Isaac Newton invoking intelligent design at the limits of his knowledge. Let's go to Christian Huygens, all right? Brilliant scientist. I mean, he was great at chemistry, biology, physics, math, Dutch scientist, and he died the year that this work was published, one of my favorite works of science writing, and it's Cosmotheros, which is an exploration on the likelihood of there being life on the known planets, using the available knowledge of the day. So, for example, they knew that, what does he say in his writings? Well, you look at the year, 1696, gravity was well known, laws of motion were well known, Newton was quite influential well before the turn of the century there. And so when he talks about the orbits of the planets, it's done. Talks about the moons of Jupiter, done. Talks about the new rings around Saturn, done. It's all fine. But when he talks about biology and life, something that's not well understood then or today, boom, there goes his references to God. But references to God were nowhere else in those writings. Nowhere else. He says, I suppose nobody would deny but that there's somewhat more of contrivance, somewhat more of miracle in the production and growth of plants and animals than in lifeless heaps of inanimate bodies. For the finger of God and the wisdom of divine providence is in them, much more clearly manifested than in the other. He doesn't say that about the orbits. We're done with the orbits, as Mike Shermer had noted. We're done. He's in a place where nobody really has the answer. So he invokes, this is intelligent design once again. Pure out, flat and simple. So, you know this story. I have to tell it because it's just great. All right? So Laplace, Pierre Simon de Laplace, at the end of the 18th century, wrote a 5-volume tome on celestial mechanics. A brilliant piece of work. It's there. It weighs a lot on the shelf. And what it does is it takes Newton's laws of gravity and brings them into a full expression with the hammer of calculus, okay? He brings all the armament of mathematics to bear on the laws of physics that were put forth by Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton only touched on them. They were not fully developed. And in this work, he demonstrates, he further develops something that had been percolating in the mathematical community, but he develops, and one might even say perfects, a branch of math we would call perturbation theory, where instead of pulling your hair out saying, well, how do you calculate this pair of forces and this pair, and all the equations go to hell, in perturbation theory, it allows you to systematically and reliably calculate the effect of a small tug in the presence, a series of small tugs in the presence of singular big tugs. And that's kind of what what's going on in most of the solar system. And when you do that, and you do that properly, you can demonstrate, notwithstanding effects of chaos, which have other timescales related to them, you can demonstrate that, in fact, the solar system was stable beyond the predictions of Isaac Newton. So he figures this out, does not invoke God, because he figured it out. And in a story that may be apocryphal, but I see more in support of it than against it, this time coincides, of course, with the era of Napoleon, Napoleon being French, and Laplace being French, no translation necessary. Napoleon, if you visited his library, it's not just sort of books of world history and battles, it's engineering books, it's physics books. This man wanted to know where his cannonballs would land, all right? He was much more than just sort of a lucky general. He was into the physics, the engineering, and the material science of war. And so he immediately summoned up the 5-volume production of Laplace, read it through, cover to cover, called in Laplace, and said, sir, I have the exact quote here. Hang on. Napoleon asked him, what role God played in the construction and regulation of the heavens. This is kind of like, that's what Newton would ask, right? Laplace replies, sir, I had no need for that hypothesis. And so what concerns me now is, even if you're as brilliant as Newton, you reach a point where you start basking in the majesty of God, and then your discovery stops. It just stops. You're kind of no good anymore for advancing that frontier, waiting for somebody else to come behind you who doesn't have God on the brain and who says, that's a really cool problem, I want to solve it. They come in and solve it. But look at the time delay. This was a 100-year time delay. And the math that's in perturbation theory is like crumbs for Newton. He could have come up with that. The guy invented calculus just on a dare, practically. When someone asked him, Ike, how come planets orbit in ellipses and not some other shape? And he couldn't answer that. He goes home for 2 months, comes back, out comes integral differential calculus, because he needed that to answer that question. And so this is the kind of mind we were dealing with Newton. He could have gone there, but he didn't. He didn't. His religiosity stopped him. And so we're left with the realization, of course, that intelligent design, while real in the history of science, while real in the presence of sort of philosophical drivers, is nonetheless a philosophy of ignorance. And so, regardless of what our political agenda is, all you have to say is, science is a philosophy of discovery, intelligent design is a philosophy of ignorance. That's all. In it, he sort of codifies the geocentric universe. And this Earth-centered universe prevailed for centuries until Copernicus and Galileo turned that around. But what I want to call your attention to are notes that he penned in the margin of the manuscript of his. Let me first start off with Ptolemy. I don't know if we know that he really looked like this, but Ptolemy, was one of the greatest scientists ever and most influential scientists. And his most important work is, of course, Almagest, which is Arabic for the greatest. And this was a mystery, complete mystery. And of course, the heavens were not Earth, and so the fact that you didn't really understand what was going up there was kind of okay and expected, because that was the work of the gods. And we, being mortal down here on Earth, if you can't understand it, don't lose sleep over that fact. You perhaps never will. Now, Ptolemy had sort of the best going explanation anyone had put forth with the epicycles and the like. But nonetheless, this is the boundary between what is known and unknown about how the machinery of the universe works, and he pens these words, which for me are one of the most beautiful and poetic references to the state of one's knowledge ever written. I know that I am mortal by nature. Work. Let me remind you that back then, you would look up at the night sky and the planets would move against the background stars. They would wander, because that's what the word means in Greek, is wanderer. And there were 7 of these objects, the sun and moon included. And they would just kind of move. They'd go to the left, and then they'd slow down and pause, and then they'd back up, and then they'd reverse